Hi, good afternoon. It's nice to be back with you. This has been an incredible day, and there's still so much more. So I hope everybody had a chance to get a snack, hydrate. We have much more to get through. Our two guests on the stage now, Zephyr, Teachout, and Representative Khanna, are so accomplished that I could take up our whole hour talking about all they've achieved. So I'm going to do shortened introductions and then give them the floor. Zephyr Teachout is a Nation editorial board member and contributor, and an associate professor of law at Fordham University. Teachout served as the director of internet organizing for the 2004 Howard Dean presidential campaign. In 2009, she helped found the Antitrust League. Teachout was the first national director of the Sunlight Foundation, which promotes transparency and accountability in government. So important, thank you. And has long been involved in and supported movements for equity and change. Teachout is the author of the book Break 'em Up, Recovering Our Freedom from Big Ag, Big Tech, and Big Money. Representative Khanna, he is a congressman who represents California's 17th congressional district located in the heart of Silicon Valley. Representative Khanna sits on the House Budget, Armed Service, and Oversight and Reform Committees, and is the Congressional Progressive Caucus first vice chair and serves as assistant whip for the Democratic Caucus. He passed the first War Powers resolution through Congress, and he wrote the book Entrepreneurial Nation: Why Manufacturing is Still Key to America's Future. There is so much more I could say about both of them, but right now I would like them to speak for themselves. And so Zephyr, please take it away.
Well, thank you so much. Hello, everybody. What an incredible, amazing group of speakers the Nation Festival has had, and we have Bernie Sanders coming up. But I am especially honored to be here with Congressman Khanna, who was challenging Democratic incumbents before it was kind of the thing to do, and actually played a really important role in early support for AOC before people knew who she was. I have so much I want to talk to you about, but I want to start with right now, Congressman Khanna, because I think a lot of people are still in a state of shock. They're still focused on what is Trump doing now, or looking forward to a few months from now when we have the really important Georgia Senate election. But we right now we're talking about tens of millions of people who are hungry, including so many children, incredible rates of unemployment around the country. Here in New York, it's still at peak levels. People who were fired and then brought back on are being laid off. High levels of despair and suicide and suffering and pain, and people are crying out for relief. What is happening right now in Congress? And you've been really outspoken about relief, but can you give us a sense of what is happening and where you think the grassroots support should be so we can actually get relief to people?
Well, Zephyr, first of all, thank you for joining me on this chat, and thank you for having this to Nation and Katrina, and an amazing lineup. And I know the Senator Sanders, having him afterwards will be fantastic. The challenge is nothing is happening, Zephyr. I mean, that's the reality. I mean, the House 5 or 6 months ago passed the $3.3 trillion relief bill. I had advocated it with some others back in March that we ought to be giving $2,000 a month to American families making under $250,000. That would have been the best way to avoid the eviction crisis we're going to face, to avoid the food shortages that we're facing, and the ending of unemployment. But that never happened. The House did pass a $3 trillion bill, and then that's been sitting there. And we passed another $2 trillion bill that's been sitting there. Now, the president had an incentive to deal about 2 weeks before the election, and some of us, even on the progressive side, said, let's make the deal, not because it was ideal. There were a number of problems, but we thought at least let's get 1.8, 1.9 trillion so that we can have unemployment extension, so we can get food stamps, so we can get some relief for the very poor. That never came to pass. McConnell was a huge obstacle. So at this point, it's really a stalemate where you have a president uninterested in governing and McConnell who is not willing to really offer much other than support for business.
So there has an open Senate seat, which I'm just going to say I'm not going to ask you about. I will just say that there's an open Senate seat in Representative Khanna's state, and I hope a lot of people listen to this incredibly powerful voice for relief. The other thing that you've been such a leader on is foreign policy, and as we look forward to a new moment with a new administration. There's a lot of speculation. There's a lot of question marks about what direction Biden will do. But I think it's really important to have a vision of what our foreign policy could be and what the key changes are. So can you lay out where you see the kind of foreign policy vision that you see the Biden administration, you think the Biden administration should pursue?
Well, I think it should be guided on two principles, on a principle of restraint and a principle of the promotion of human rights. And those two principles would avoid the interventions that we've seen in Iraq, in escalation in Afghanistan, in Libya, in Syria, where we called for the overthrow of Assad and then didn't follow it up with any action, and it ended up becoming a cesspool for a civil war. Having a greater sense of humility and restraint would avoid the situation in Yemen, which Senator Sanders and I passed the first war powers resolution. I mean, we were basically aiding the Saudis in a proxy war with Iran. And a real commitment to restraint would be for the Biden administration in the first 2 weeks to pass that war powers resolution and stop our logistical support to the Saudis, both in terms of spare parts and in terms of intelligence support until Martin Griffiths can get that war to come to an end and prevent a famine that is imminent. And then we have to have a promotion of human rights, meaning that we cooperate to tackle climate change, which affects people around the world. We cooperate to tackle global poverty. We cooperate to spread primary education. We cooperate to stand up for women's rights and minority rights and make sure that there's no persecution. So restraint doesn't mean withdrawal from the international system. Quite the contrary, it means leading, but not leading with military intervention.
Yeah. And what do you see as the sort of key challenge to that vision? Like we're talking to people who are all over the country and who are looking at Biden at that question mark. What do you think are the key hurdles to get over? What do we have to what are the roadblocks even within our own party?
Well, we need to be honest about some of the mistakes. I mean, I don't mind sharing with the nation audience because she's likely to be our defense secretary. But when Michelle Flournoy came to address the House Democratic Caucus, the speaker was introducing her, and then members line up in the House caucus to ask questions. So I stood up and I said, Secretary Flournoy, will you admit today that the speaker was absolutely right to say that we shouldn't have had an increase of troops in Afghanistan, and you were absolutely wrong? And the speaker just glared at me like, you don't treat guests like that. But the point is, there has to be an acknowledgement of some of these people who have had incorrect decisions, that they were wrong, and a reflection, if they're going to serve, what they've learned and how they're going to be better going forward. And then looking at where the defense budget is. I mean, it would be appalling for me if we just ratify the bloated defense budgets of the Trump administration, at the very least bring it back to Obama levels and have it be smart in actually protecting American security from the varied threats, whether it's a pandemic, whether it's a cyber attack, and not just investing in new aircraft carriers.
Yeah. So what we've had a little conversation of this offline, but what should progressives be doing right now? So we have in the state houses, we may have some opportunities. There's a really important transition moment with the Biden-Harris transition, and I think people are rightly really focused on that. In the world that I pay attention to, extraordinary agency power to really do some real stimulus through rulemaking, through the FTC rulemaking, through the Department of Agriculture rulemaking. It's not just, it sounds like it's just doing antitrust. There's no such thing as just antitrust. It's actually shifting money from the hands of investors to workers and small businesses. And so I see this extraordinary opportunity for Biden. But I do also see, some of the there's a sort of center of gravity, a tendency to just return to 2012, 2013. Now, my own view is there is no return, that we are in a very dynamic moment. But right now, looking forward to 2 years from now for just a second, there is a really key Senate election. I know people are focused on in January, as they should be. But my view is, if Democrats really lead, if Joe Biden really takes this opportunity to use the executive branch powers that he has, which are expansive, and really leads in foreign policy, these are the big ifs, we have a real opportunity to then win even more seats in the Senate, hoping that Ossoff and Warnock win, and start to push through some of the really ambitious legislation-based projects. I mean, I'd love to see how you see the Warnock and Ossoff are going to win, but let's be clear, a 50-50 vote, 50 members of the Democratic, 50 Democrats is a very thin line, along with Vice President Harris. What do you see as the key things that can be accomplished if we don't get to that 50? If it's still McConnell totally running the game in the Senate?
Well, first, I think we have to continue with an agenda that is popular with the American people and pass it through the House and have the President Biden and Vice President Harris publicly build support. So much of politics is about leadership. It's about building public support. Senator Sanders, Senator Warren have done that exceptionally well. It's not just about passing a particular bill. It's about mobilizing support and then putting pressure on senators, not by playing hardball politics, but by saying you're going to defy the will of the American people and really making them vote no on a $15 minimum wage, on expanding Medicare, on investments in green technology that's going to create jobs in places like Pennsylvania and Ohio, because solar panel installers and wind turbine technicians are some of the fastest growing jobs. Force them to say, no, we're actually going to defend fossil fuel subsidies as opposed to investments in new technology. Force them to say, no, we're not going to forgive student loans. So I think it would be a mistake to pull punches and not to have a bold agenda. That said, if it is really stalling in a Senate, and if we can't, and by the way, we should also be fine picking off senators. I don't think there should be any deference to McConnell and tradition, and you don't go around McConnell. Go around McConnell every possible way to get a wavering senator or two to try to build the coalition. But if we can't get things done, then I think you're right on executive action. I mean, we've seen Schumer and Warren call for student loan forgiveness. There's a lot of, as you've written about so eloquently, a lot of things on antitrust that can be done with stronger appointments at the FTC and at the FCC and at the DOJ. There are rulemaking at the Department of Labor that can be done in terms of proper classification of employees and employees' right to bargain and right to unionize. There are regulations on the Clean Power Plan that can incentivize greater investments in clean technology. So remember, I mean, most of Obama's 6 years after the first two were in a Republican-dominated Congress, and he was still able to get a lot of important things done. And so I think we have to push forward with, as you put it, as much executive action then as possible.
You know, I say that as somebody who genuinely loves the legislative branch. Like, you know, that in a really functioning democracy, the legislative branch with aggressive hearings, investigations, really engaging the public in decision making is the dream. And so I guess I have another question, which is like, how can we get more aggressive, strategic, long-term hearings in Congress? In my field, David Cicilline has done an incredible job as the chairman of the House Antitrust Subcommittee, which I think you co-founded. Is that?
Well, I was a co-founder of the House Antitrust Caucus, but he's the chair of the Judiciary Committee Antitrust, and along with some people like who Lena Khan and others who were staff, they did a fantastic job in raising these issues.
And what they did is they really, they pushed for questions. They asked, they sent out query after query to the big tech CEOs. They got millions of documents. And when you compare that hearing to other hearings with big tech, which have been a little more theater, you really see the difference. Like, one is serious investigations. And one of the powerful things that came out of that is it's not that the Republicans signed on to all the conclusions, but they actually, Congressman Buck wrote a report where he said, we have a serious monopolization problem. We've got to do something about it. It wasn't the usual partisan, it wasn't the same partisan alignment. And you saw the way in which small business owners and workers coming to testify along with the deep investigation really allowed for the creation of some bipartisan action. So do you think we can see Congress do more of that, do more use of its power, threaten subpoena power for big corporations, sometimes use it against big corporations?
Absolutely. And I think those hearings were very effective. There were concrete results. I mean, one of the things that came out of it was a duty to deal fairly with sellers, a standard in Europe that there's no reason, in my view, we shouldn't have here. And that means that Amazon just can't kick off someone from their platform. It means Apple shouldn't be charging 30% commission to use their platform. It turns out that even without legislation, I've heard that Apple is now considering saying, okay, if you're making less than $1 million, we're going to have a 15% fee. Now, it's not as far as the report would have you go, but they would never have done that if it weren't for the Sicilian report. So it just shows that you can have, Congress has a power to make a impact short of actual legislation in actually changing behavior. When Senator Sanders and I introduced the Stop Bezos Act, within a few weeks, Bezos announced a $15 minimum wage. And I think we underestimate our power to convene, to investigate, to mobilize public pressure that can effectuate a change, even if it is not legislative change.
Yeah. So you are writing, thinking, talking a lot about our digital future. Can you talk a little bit about two things? One, Prop 22 in California. So to me, one of the greatest tragedies of this election cycle was the real success of what I saw of Uber and Lyft effectively buying a referendum in California, forcing drivers to carry advertisements for their referendum. Many people think this is not the end, but a beginning of pushing a kind of business model. I think this, pushing a kind of business model where you separate power and responsibility, the platforms extract, workers aren't treated with the dignity that they deserve. You were right there in the center of the fight. Can you tell us a little bit about what we can learn from that and how we can make sure that we don't have another versions of Prop 22 elsewhere in the country?
Well, Uber and Lyft's arguments were just outrageous, and they spent $200 million to pass a referendum that overturned the will of the California legislature. I mean, here's the argument that Uber was making in court before this actually went to the referendum. They were arguing that they're a technology company and that their employees are tech workers and not the Uber driver. I mean, it just defies common sense. When you get into an Uber, do you think that the person who's serving you is the driver or some tech software person? And it's so demeaning because it basically is saying that anyone who's not a techie, who's not a coder, is somehow not essential to the business model. It's actually perpetuating the divide in our society between those who are doing things remotely and working in offices and those who are doing essential services. So it's not just that it's unfair to the workers, it's sort of a pernicious mindset that is animating these companies. And it is, what I say is, look, is the Uber app a great invention in terms of being able to hail a ride wherever you want it? Absolutely. But it's not innovation to build business models over exploitation of employees. And all they have to do is, if they didn't have that, it would cost them about $500 million more. It would probably raise the cost of raising capital, and maybe they won't be a $50 billion company. Maybe they'd be a $20 billion company. But it's not that they wouldn't be able to survive. It would just be that the prices may be a little higher, and the stock price would be a little lower. So this is something that is a total transfer of wealth from the workers to the investor class. And this is what's so important to realize is, our minimum wage, for example, kept in line with worker productivity from 38 to 68. And then that was severed. And if productivity rise if the wage had increased with the productivity rise, it would be $24 today. So a lot of what is going on is not charity for workers. It's saying workers are not getting their market value. They're not getting what they're producing because of distortive laws in our society. And I think this has to be one of the priorities of the Biden administration, to pass a proper classification law nationally, or to have the NLRB and DOL guidelines of proper classification. One other point, it's not sufficient to just say people need to be employees, because a lot of times the janitors, bus drivers, security guards are employees, but they're employees of a subcontractor, and they don't have the right to bargain with the parent company. And this was a Reagan change in 1984. Before 1984, basically, you did have the right to bargain with your parent employer, the Apple or Google. And so I really think we have to go to a labor law framework before 84. And it's in the enlightened self-interest of tech companies to make sure workers are benefiting from the digital age, but they haven't done that. And so what the consequences is people's rents have gone up, they've been gentrified, their wages haven't kept pace, and you have extraordinary wealth disparity in tech centers.
Yeah, I mean, you talk about Reagan, and I've been thinking about this a lot with Biden, is that we have been living inside Reagan's world to such a degree that we don't realize that we've just naturalized so much of the language, and moving to a labor framework, to a power framework, to an antitrust framework, make it easier for workers to organize so that they can have dignity, raise the minimum wage, but also make sure the minimum wage isn't a maximum wage. These are not, as you say, these are not innovations. These are just sort of old forms of feudalism that we used to understand that we had to fight. I was just looking at LaGuardia here in New York, dealing with the taxi problem in the early 30s. Too much congestion, workers were paid too badly, and big monopolist came in and said, "Here, let me manage it," and then was caught spending, in today's equivalent, millions of dollars bribing the mayor. Led to the later mayor LaGuardia saying, "No, we can't trust these private companies to run our transportation system because it's bad for public transportation, it's bad for our workers, it's bad for all of us." And as you say, it's a really insidious business model. But I think it's the loss there suggests that there's a real need to pre-organize against it, to really be sort of inoculate ourselves against the Uber, Lyft, not just for drivers, although the drivers' lives, I mean, if you've been talking to drivers these days, you know the degree of desperation. But as a business model for all of society. I know you've also done a lot of work on really pushing broadband. And what do you see as the opportunities now? Can we be doing more at the state level? Where are the pressure points so we can finally get to the universal broadband that seems essential for a modern society?
Well, we've been talking about this for 25 years, and it still doesn't happen. And Clyburn has actually a very good plan, $80 billion to have high-speed internet access to everywhere in the country. It's about what it cost 2 years in Afghanistan. So think about that. I mean, if we had been there for 18 years instead of 20 years, we could have had the entire country hooked up to high-speed internet and give people access to remote jobs, to participating in in wealth creation of a digital economy and being able to stay in the communities where they grew up and not having to leave. But I think that the high-speed broadband is just table stakes. I mean, the challenge has been that when you look at the digital economy, twice the median average in terms of jobs, $80,000 on average is a tech job. They have about 12 million jobs, so it's about as many jobs as manufacturing, expected to grow to 25 million in 5 years, almost double manufacturing jobs. And its contribution to the GDP is already about what manufacturing is. Imagine if manufacturing were concentrated in 2 or 3 cities and disconnected. I mean, manufacturing had a network where it helped at the time coal towns because that was the source of energy, and railroad towns. What you have now is total prosperity in certain regions disconnected from the prosperity in other parts of the country, excluding rural America, minority communities. 90% of the S&P 500's gain over the last 5 years has been the big tech companies and Microsoft. And it's no coincidence that the racial wealth gap has increased over the last 3 decades, because the digital economy arguably is more exclusive than the industrial age and the industrial economy. And in the industrial economy, you had actual segregation. So this is a huge challenge for us, is how do we give communities and people excluded access to the wealth generation of the 21st century? How do we make sure they're not just consumers of products, but actually producers for their own community and have some say in what those platforms look like? One other quick point, because you brought up this Reagan thing, I think it's important to realize a lot of these tech companies came into existence during this Reagan libertarian sentiment. And so they have this reflexive opposition to any regulation, any internal regulation. But it really, at some points, is absurd, because put aside the question of Brandenburg and free speech. Let's just say Facebook, we take their argument, okay, that they are a private entity. If the Nation tomorrow were to publish op-eds from the Ku Klux Klan or QAnon, or someone on the far left, a dictator on the far left, they'd be excoriated, they'd be laughed at, they'd be ridiculed. And yet Facebook, which is presenting this content to the world, hides behind sort of this defense of free speech absolutism without any moral responsibility for their judgment. And I think this kind of absolute defense of sort of anything goes freedom is really stems from their birth in the Reagan era, when the Reagan era was at its height.
I really think it's so important how you are connecting this to an overall industrial policy. That we are talking about a moment, and yes, legislation would be great, but for now, this is something Biden can lead on, is a vision for an industrial policy that includes our trade policy, that includes making sure that we are not so vulnerable that we can see the kind of shock to the system that killed so many early on because of the incredible concentration in our medical systems, that we do not have this incredible geographic inequality and racial inequality. And, right now, you add Reagan and a deep naturalized neoliberalism, such that we sort of think of it as natural, and all we can do is increase taxes, which, by the way, I support. We absolutely need to increase taxes, but it's more than that. It's a global system of how power is distributed, that there's so many more tools than taxation to have a more fair and thriving economy, which, again, go ahead. Yeah. Yeah,
no, I completely agree with you. Look, we have to increase taxes to invest in the education and healthcare on the wealthy, but it's not enough to just have a tax system that provides people with benefits if you exclude them from the economic production of wealth, and if you demand that they leave communities and move to towns where they don't want to live. So one of the most insightful people, actually, John Nichols, who writes for The Nation, tells me about Wisconsin and Kenosha. Everyone talked about Jacob Blake and obviously the awful police violence, but it turns out that Kenosha has an Amazon fulfillment center with 3,000 people there. And those 3,000 people all were in manufacturing or other jobs that were making $25. Now they're making $15. They are not having great working conditions. And in Kenosha, there are none of the jobs of the 80,000, 100,000, the actual software engineers or the tech development, none of those jobs are there. So you have Kenosha basically being a center where you're not getting good paying jobs, where Amazon has no commitment, and you have people frustrated with the change in the economy. Well, what are we doing to bring good paying economic jobs and prospects to Kenosha, Wisconsin? And I think it's a simple question, but I think that's really the question that the Democratic Party has to answer, because Trump's answer is let's move back to the 50s and 60s. Implausible. But what is our answer? Yes, after we provide people healthcare, after we provide them education, after we provide them Social Security, how are we going to give them the dignity and pride of the type of economic productivity for their kids that they once had? And I think that the antitrust, I think, gets to a piece of it, because until you have these huge companies controlling access and denying access to small businesses and others, you're hurting the economic production. But I think until we understand that we have a harder challenge than just redistribution, we have exclusion from economic production in our economy, we will remain deeply divided.
Yeah, I mean, when you talk, I just hear the debates of the 1880s and 1890s, and they're relevant for a lot of reasons. But one reason is that you had a similar total change in the economy, just total transformation in the economy. And everybody understood that these were the core questions. The questions were, how do we have a thriving economy? How do we have a democracy with mass industrialization? And there were four main answers to it. And right now, we've just sort of naturalized the corporatist answer instead of looking at all the other different ways in which you can organize and structure power. And of course, the incredible sort of failure of that moment was that early organizing was cross-racial. And then the progressives and populists abandoned and then became open segregationists. So there was sort of, and I think sometimes people also overnaturalize history, like it had to be that way. There was a moment where it was possible to imagine a cross-racial, thriving, post-industrial democracy. I bring that up because right now it's so important to also talk about the racial disparities in these impacts. You know, we are facing a collapse of small businesses, but that collapse is falling especially hard on business owners of color. Some people think as many as 50% of Black businesses may go under because of this. Because of the pandemic, but it's the pandemic built on a system that doesn't allow for local thriving and strong communities, but is a very, very top-down system. I'm getting a note that we should move to questions. So enjoying this conversation, but let's move over and where do we?
Sure. Can I just surface them up to you guys and you can both jump in. Ann Martin asks or points out that having a president and vice president trumpeting House bills to the public may be the change we need to get the Senate to move more bills, but this didn't really work when the Biden administration had the same opportunity, did it? And she adds to that, is there a problem with an over-reliance on executive power?
Well, I think that.
Go ahead. Yeah.
I think that the times have changed from Obama. We're in a post-pandemic economy. There's more of a crisis. There's a recognition, I think, from a lot of people that the stimulus should have been bigger. There's a desire in this country for on both across partisan lines for there to be action. And there's probably a willingness to take a more aggressive approach in confronting McConnell in the Senate, or there should be a willingness to take an aggressive approach every day, having press conferences talking about what we've passed and why McConnell is standing in the way of progress of the American people. So I think that in a legislative strategy, that is our best option until we control the Senate. Of course, there are dangers to executive overreach, and I certainly would not want the executive branch in matters of war and peace or in matters of civil liberties taking actions that defy the people's rights. And Congress, I would speak out against that, whether it was a Republican or a Democrat. But there are statutory guidelines that give the president the authority to take action on economic crises or to deal with fair worker conditions. And I think our president should take advantage of what Congress has statutorily allowed him to do.
I mean, when it comes to the use of executive power for anti-monopoly, the Obama administration didn't do a good job. And in fact, the FTC was basically following in a deeply what Reagan introduced in the Revolution, a consumer welfare framework. The Federal Trade Commission has the authority and responsibility to do rulemaking when they see serious monopolization problems in our society. And in fact, the FTC was granted power, this is part of Brandeis's vision, to deal with new situations, new technologies, new forms of abuse. So right now, it would be fitting with the congressional grant of power to the FTC to, for instance, broaden the mandate. So it's not just looking at consumer welfare, but impact on workers. That's just one small but major shift. And recent research shows that concentration in our economy effectively operates as a $15,000 per year transfer from each worker to investors. So I see Biden's role here as similar to, FDR facing the Great Depression. It is an emergency moment. It's an emergency for people's faith in our society, but it's also an emergency for people surviving. And in such emergency moments, laying out this vision and using that executive power, and then I'll love it when Congress comes roaring back in a few years with the Democratic Senate if we do our job for these 2 years. And that's a big if. If you bring a weak approach, I think it's going to be a lot harder to win the Senate in a few years. So I think it's actually incumbent on Biden to use to direct the Federal Trade Commission and the Department of Agriculture to deal with the abuses that are ongoing in big ag and big tech.
So, what we've heard the past few days in the festival and quite frankly heard for quite a while is that, the Democratic Party has, we have failed some of our citizens. We do not talk well about the programs we want to do. We need to be people first. We need to make people understand the benefits and the opportunities. And we are terrible at messaging. And what you were just saying is that we have to, be bold and be good at messaging. So what's changed? What tools do we have? Are we going to be able to do this thing that we've been bad at lately?
Well, Congressman Khanna has won a tough election against an incumbent and has has, I think, done an incredible job of showing what leadership looks like. And I would say part of what Congressman Khanna does effectively is he combines action with messaging. Even the act of turning to messaging first instead of action, I think can sometimes make people feel like, well, you're in Congress, do something. And his incredible leadership in foreign policy and elsewhere, showing that we can push forward resolutions, we can act. I actually think it's really important. I think often among the left, we spend way too much time sort of debating about other people instead of using the power we have. And I guess that's the thing that I think is the most important. Use the power we have. And as Congressman Khanna says, if you run up against a wall with McConnell, make sure it's not just McConnell, but every single senator who is taking that vote against the people in their district. So I want to start with action as opposed to starting with messaging. But I do think it's critical to lay out a non-nostalgic vision. And that's what Congressman Khanna is saying. It's not a vision of okay, we can just sort of retreat back to something safe, because people haven't felt safe for a long time.
Thank you. Ian Jelenic asks about broadband. Broadband needs to be like water, a utility, a public-private partnership. How does Taiwan or how do other countries do it?
Well, they made the investment. I mean, it's as simple as that. I mean, China has hooked up 99% of their country to broadband, and it just hasn't been a priority in our country. We've been talking about it for 20 years and haven't done it. And I think this goes to Zephyr's very important point that it's not just about messaging. It's not just about dialogue and showing up in red counties. I mean, 100 of the 220 counties that went from Trump to from Obama to Trump, Trump carried 170 of them. And it's not just talking to these communities. I think it is actually figuring out what we're going to do to deliver on job creation and what we're going to do to make the case that in a digital economy, in a transformed economy, their kids, the best thing we can do is invest in their education and invest in their healthcare, that is the recipe for economic growth. And I think that the progressive movement does not use the language of economic growth, of job creation, of wealth creation enough. We're not just a party that says, okay, we're going to take and give. We're a party that says we understand the recipe of what built America's successful working and middle class, what built thriving communities, and we're going to do that. And we can have pilot programs. We created 30 jobs in Jefferson, Iowa, and jobs in Beckley, West Virginia, and Clarksville, Mississippi. And people said, why only 10 or 20 jobs? But the creation of those jobs actually show that people are caring and understanding the grievance and the frustration. So I think, one, the Democratic Party needs to have a forward-looking aspirational message. We need to have a message about job creation, economic growth, and then we need to tie Medicare for all, free public college, childcare as constituent parts of this framework of what will allow us to compete and thrive in the 21st century. We should frame these policies as forward-looking, almost necessitated by the economic transformations that we have.
It's just so beautiful because it's like that is what education is, and people really want great education for their children. They really want that. But we've accepted a framework that is sort of more about testing and less about thriving. And for healthcare, I mean, again, Congressman Khanna has been a great leader on this. Of course, we need Medicare for all. But that is tied to a vision of economic thriving. It's only when you have Medicare for all can you have people feel like, okay, I can take this moment and switch a job or start a company. And there's a sense of hope and possibility, creating a fertile ground. When you look at, parts of Texas that were moving towards Trump, and the top thing on their mind was the economy, it's really important for us to be speaking to people who are understandably scared about a fragile system and talk about the powerful, safe, and thriving world that we can create.
Biden's talked a bit about student loan debt forgiveness. How likely do you think that is to be early on the agenda and to move forward?
I think it would be very smart for him to do. I think Schumer and Warren have a very good proposal about $50,000 for people making under $100,000 to forgive it. And I don't know if he'll go that far. I hope he'll do it. But I force the Republicans to sue in court, saying they're the ones who are suing to block student loan forgiveness. And again, make this about we want these young people to go and start businesses. We want them to start families. We want them to buy houses. We don't want our best and brightest to have to run to Wall Street instead of teaching and going into public service and being pillars in their community because of the debt they have, that this is sapping America of the talent and sapping us of the potential of a next generation to create opportunity. I think we win arguments on fairness because our policies intrinsically are in my view, are more fair. What we don't win is arguments about empowerment, creation of wealth, aspiration. And if we frame our policies as both fair, but also what builds successful societies and thriving communities, which I actually believe that they do, I think they will appeal to a broader range of people. I think you could actually have support for the left, quote unquote, left policy in suburbs.
I mean, one of the things that I think is the most exciting, it's just at a small level now, but it's starting to happen, is coalitions of small business and labor coming together. And so it's work-based, but it's two different kinds of work-based. And the other time you saw this coalition is in FDR's second term, and coming together both to fight against, corporate monopolies, but also to say, hey, I'm a spectrum technician and I'm skilled. And I know that in a fair society, I would be treated well enough that I could have a vacation with my family and be treated with dignity. And I've got a vision for that. And when you see these coalitions of small business and labor coming together, I think that's where a lot of the fertility and excitement is. It's very much about work. It's deeply cross-racial, and it does require naming enemies too. It's like, it's not innocent. It's not nobody doing this to us. There is Uber is doing this to us. Amazon is doing this to us. Amazon is stealing from small business owners and abusing workers. Tyson recently in the news about Tyson managers gambling about which workers would get COVID. Tyson is doing this to us. Tyson is doing this to farmers, and it's doing it to workers. And when you see those together, it's a hard partnership, but it's the key to, I think, a moving forward.
Thank you. On a slightly different tact, a question from Carol Bolin Abrahamson. How will we deal with Trump and his family after they leave the White House? Will they represent an ongoing national security risk? And I would also add to that, should Trump and his team be held accountable? And if there should be accountability, what does that look like?
Well, I think the national security risk they pose is the degradation of American democracy. And I'm a big fan of Lincoln's Lyceum address. And Lincoln, it was 3738, he writes about the real threat to American democracy is not as external, even back then, but it was the rise of demagoguery within the body politic. And to me, the challenge and the threat that Trump poses is he still has 75 million followers, and he's spreading misinformation and conspiracy theories to a group of people that are going to be further polarized. And I guess my interest is to figure out how do we solve some of the structures of social media and the media environment so that we don't have these cesspools of misinformation and conspiracy. How do we figure out how to democratize access to the economy, and how do we deal with some of these structural issues rather than just obsessing about Trump? That said, I think the criminal process and all should play out and shouldn't be interfered with by politicians. But what I don't want to do is give him more oxygen. I don't want us to be obsessing about Trump. I think what we ought to be doing is figuring out why are we in a state of American democracy that has allowed for almost half the country to vote for Donald Trump.
I mean, I couldn't agree more. I think on the one hand, of course he should be held accountable. This is sort of a rule of law question, but we all individually and collectively as a media environment have a responsibility to not give it a lot of air. It's just a fact that what he and other people have done that may be criminal needs to be investigated. On the platforms, speaking of things that we've naturalized that are so crazy, if your school bus or your public library was funded, had the same business model that Facebook did, people would be fighting all the time because the more conflict, the longer you stay. It would be the most conspiracy theories, white nationalism, and censors everywhere to follow your every move. Now, this is the center of our communications infrastructure right now. And I think we treat it as a sort of given that this is the business model that has to happen. But I think this business model is, I think it's pretty clear the business model itself is toxic, and we have to stop playing whack-a-mole and saying, hey, what do we think we want our communications infrastructure to look like? That's honestly harder without a Democratic Senate, but there's a lot of energy towards that, because it's like having the ground you walk on be fighting against you. It's so dangerous for our democracy for companies, YouTube as well, owned by Google, to be actively promoting, not just allowing, that's a whole different thing, promoting the most conflict-ridden, toxic, and hateful and conspiracy-focused speech.
Thank you.
Zephyr, right. So 64% of people on Facebook, I read somewhere, that joined QAnon were actually targeted by Facebook's recommendation function. So they take our data, construct profiles, and then push QAnon. It's almost as if they knew someone had an eating disorder and were pushing dieting techniques to them. So there's definitely significant change and regulation needed to deal with that toxicity.
Thank you. We are almost out of time. This hour flew by. And Representative Khanna, I give you the last question. What do you expect to see, or what would you push for in the first 90 days of the Biden administration?
Well, we need the biggest stimulus we could possibly get, understanding that Paul Krugman and Christina Romer and Joseph Stiglitz were right in 2008, that the stimulus wasn't big enough, and that's partly many things led to Donald Trump, but the inadequate stimulus was one of them. And so we really need to push for as much relief to people. Obviously, we need to have better contact tracing, hire thousands of people to do contact tracing, better understanding of how we're going to get the distribution networks for the vaccine, investments in communities that have been most hard hit. I think we need an essential workers bill of rights. So we're actually helping the people and standing up for the people who have been most at risk in the economy. And then we should start talking about job creation with infrastructure, with broadband, with the other types of investments in communities left behind that are going to provide capital and encourage them to participate in the engines of economic growth. And then, of course, climate change, which is also, in my view, linked to job creation in all of these new industries. But I guess I would just say that what we're trying to do as a country is very, very difficult. There has never, in my view, been a truly multiracial, multi-ethnic democracy in the world. I mean, England is about 87% white, Canada 87% white for all of Trudeau's multiculturalism. Australia is 80-some% white. We're 60% white, and we literally have people from all over the world. So the challenge of emerging as a multiracial, multi-ethnic democracy compounded at a time of fundamental economic change is, I think, what has led to so much of the polarization. And if Biden, and I do think he has the temperament for this, can push a bold agenda, but while at the same time tempering the bravado and certitude that people express themselves in tweets. I mean, one of the greatest dangers that social media has done is everyone writes a clever tweet and they think they have the genius of Lin-Manuel Miranda. They don't. I mean, this is a hurting thinking and reading and introspection and examination. And I think that the President Biden has a chance to set a new tone of how we talk to each other in our democracy and try to rebuild a real public dialogue to emerge as a multiracial, multi-ethnic democracy.
Thank you. Zephyr, did you want to add anything quickly?
The last thing I'll say is that I think that Congressman Khanna would make an extraordinary senator. And his own temperament, his deep care for his constituents, which you've seen, but also just like a temperamental bravery and a deep, loving bravery is something that we all could really use in the Senate. So it's been a real honor to do this conversation with you.
It's my honor. And I'm looking forward to your future public service in whatever way you do that, Zephyr.
Thank you very much, both of you. We are up next is Senator Bernie Sanders.